The Chronicles of Narnia, The Magician's Nephew. Chapter 1. The Wrong Door. This is a story about something that happened long ago when your grandfather was a child. It is a very important story because it shows how all of the comings and goings between our own world and the land of Narnia first began. In those days, Mr. Sherlock Holmes was still living in Baker Street, and the Bastables were looking for the treasure in the Welsham Road. In those days, if you were a boy, you had to wear a stiff Eton collar every day, and schools were usually nastier than now, but meals were nicer, and as for sweets, I won't tell you how cheap and good they were, because it would only make your mouth water in vain. And in those days, there lived a girl called Polly Plummer. She lived in one of the long row houses which were all joined together. One morning, she was out in the back garden when a boy scrambled up the garden next door. Put his face over the wall. Polly was very surprised, because up till now there had never been children in that house, but only Mr. Kettley and Miss Kettley, a boy, a brother and a sister, old bachelor and old maid, living together. So she looked up, full of curiosity. The face of the strange boy was very grubby. It could hardly have been grubbier if he had first rubbed his hands in the earth, and then had a good cry, but then dried his face with his hands. As a matter of fact, this is nearly what he had been doing. "Hello," said Polly. "Hello," said the boy. "What's your name?" "Polly," said Polly. "What's yours?" "Diggory," said the boy. "I say, what a funny name," said Polly. "It isn't half as funny as Polly," said Diggory. "Yes, it is," said Polly. "No, it isn't," said Diggory. "At any rate, I do wash my face," said Polly, "which is what you need to do, especially after—" and then she stopped. She had been going to say after you've been bubbling, but she thought she wouldn't be polite. "All right, I have them," said Diggory with a much louder voice, like a boy who was miserable that he didn't care who he knew had been crying. "And so would you," he went on, "if you lived all your life in the country and had a pony and a river at the bottom of the garden, and then been brought to live in a beastly hole like this." "London isn't a hole," said Polly indignantly, but the boy was too wound up to take any notice of her, and he went on, "And if your father was away in India, and you had to come and live with an aunt and an uncle who were like that, and if the reason you were there was you were looking after your mother, and if your mother was ill and was going to die," his face went the wrong sort of shape, as it does you're trying to keep back your tears. "I didn't know, I'm sorry," said Polly humbly, and then, because she hardly knew what to say, also turned Diggory's mind to cheerful subjects and asked, "Is Mr. Kettley really mad?" "Well, either he's mad," said Diggory, "or there's some other mystery. He has a study on the top floor, and Aunt Letty says I must never go up there. But it looks fishy to begin with, and there's another thing. Whether he tried to say to me at mealtime, he never tries to talk to her. She always shuts him up. She says, 'Don't worry about the boy, Andrew,' or I'm sure Diggory doesn't want to hear about that. Or else, 'Now, Diggory, wouldn't you like to go out and play in the garden?' What sort of thing does he try to say?" "I don't know. He never gets far enough. But there's more than that. One night, it was the last night, in fact, I was going to pass the foot of the attic stairs on my way to bed. I don't care for going past them either. I'm sure I heard a yell. Perhaps he kept a mad wife shut up there. Yes, I thought of that. Or perhaps he's a coiner. Or he might have been a pirate, like the man at the beginning of the Treasure Island, and is always hiding from his old shipmates." "How exciting," said Polly. "I never knew your house was so interesting." "You might think it's interesting," said Diggory, "but you won't like it if you had to sleep there. How would you like to lie awake, listening for Uncle Andrew's steps to come creeping along the passage to your room, and he has such awful eyes. That was how Polly and Diggory got to know one another, and it was as it was just at the beginning of the summer holidays. Neither of them was going to the sea that year, and they met nearly every day. Their adventures began chiefly because they knew it was one of the wettest and coldest summers there had been for years. What drove them to do indoor things, you might say. Indoor exploration. It is wonderful how much exploring you can do with a stump of candle in a big house or in a row of houses. Polly had discovered long ago that if you opened a certain little door in the box room attic of her house, you could find the kitchen and the dark place behind it, which you could get in by a little careful climbing. The dark place was like a long tunnel with a brick wall on one side and sloping roof on the other. In the roof there was little chunks of light between the slates. There was no floor in this tunnel. You had to step from rafter to rafter, and between them there was only plaster. If you stepped on this, you would find yourself falling through the ceiling of the room below. Polly used a bit of the tunnel just beside the sister as a smuggler's cave. She had brought up bits of old packing cases and seats of broken kitchen chairs and things of that sort, and spread them across the rafter so as to make up a bit of a floor. Here she kept a cash box containing various treasures, a story she was writing, usually a few apples. She often drank a quiet bottle of ginger beer in there. The old bottles made it look more like a smuggler's cave. Twiggy quite liked the cave. She wouldn't let him see the story, but he was more interested in exploring. "Look here," he said. "How long does this tunnel go on for? I mean, does it stop where your house ends?" "No," said Polly, "the walls don't go out to the roofs. It goes on, I don't know how far." "Then we should get to the length of the whole row of houses. So we could, and I say, we could get into other houses." "Yes, and get taken for burglary. No thanks." "Oh, don't be so jolly clever. I was thinking of the house beyond yours." "What about it?" "Why, it's the empty one. Daddy always says it had been empty since we came here." "I suppose we ought to have a look at it then," said Diggory. He was a good deal more excited than you have thought from the way he spoke. For of course he was thinking, just as you had been before, all the reasons why the house might have been empty so long. So was Polly. Neither of them said the word haunted, and both felt that one thing had been suggested it would be feeble not to do it. "Shall we go on and try it now?" said Diggory. "All right," said Polly. "Don't if you'd rather not," said Diggory. "It's a game if you are," said she. "How are we going to know we're in the next house but one?" They decided they would have to go out into the box room, walk across it, taking steps as long as the steps from one rafter to the next. That would give them an idea of how many rafters went to a room. They would allow about 4 more for the passage between 2 attics in Polly's house, and then the same number for the maid's bedroom as for the box room. That would give them the length of the house. Then if they'd done that distance twice, they would be at the end of Diggory's house. Any door they came to after that would lead them into an attic of the empty house. "But I don't expect it's really empty at all," said Diggory. What do you expect?" "I expect someone lives there in secret, only coming in and out at night with a dark lantern. We shall probably discover a gang of desperate criminals and get a reward. It's all rot to say a house would be empty all those years unless there was some mystery." "Daddy said it must be the drains," said Polly. "Oh, grown-ups are always thinking of uninteresting explanations," said Diggory. Now they were talking by daylight in the attic instead of candlelight in the smuggler's cave. It seemed much less likely that the empty house would be haunted. When they'd measured the attic, they had to get a pencil and do a sum. They both got different answers to it at first. Even when they agreed, I'm not so sure if they got it right. They were in a hurry to start on the exploration. We mustn't make a sound, said Polly as they climbed up in again behind the whister, because it was such an important occasion that they took a candle each. Polly had a good store of them in her cave. It was very dark and dusty and draughty, but they stepped from rafter to rafter without a word, except from when they whispered to each other, "We're opposite your attic now. All this must be halfway through our house." And neither of them stumbled. The candles didn't go out, and at last they could see a little door with brick wall up on their right. There was no bolt or handle on this side of it, of course, for the door had been made for getting in, not for getting out. There was a catch, as there often is on the inside of a cupboard door, which they felt sure they would be able to stick to turn. "Shall I?" said Diggory. "It's a game if you are," said Polly as she said both before. Both felt that it was becoming very serious, but neither of them would draw back. Diggory pushed around the catch with some difficulty. The door swung open, and the daylight made them blink. Then, with a great shock, they saw they were looking at not a deserted attic, but a furnished room. It seemed empty, though. It was dead silent. Polly's curiosity got the better of her. She blew out her candle and stepped into the strange room, making no more noise than a mouse. It was shaped, of course, like an attic, but furnished as a sitting room. Every bit of the walls was lined with shelves, and every bit of the shelves was full of books. A fire was burning in the grate. You remember it's a very cold, wet summer that year. And in front of the fireplace, with its back towards them, is a high black-backed armchair. Between the chair and Polly, filling most of the middle of the room, was a big table pile with all sorts of things. Printed books of the sort you write in, ink bottles and pens, and sealing wax and a microscope. What she noticed first was a bright red, and filling most of the middle of the room was a big table pile with all sorts of things. Printed books of the sort you write in, ink bottles and pens, and sealing wax and a microscope. What she noticed first was a bright red wooden tray with a number of rings on it. They were in pairs, a yellow one and a green one together, then a little space, and then there was another yellow one and another green one. They were no bigger than ordinary rings. No one could help noticing them because they were so bright. They were the most beautiful, shiny little things you can imagine. If Polly had been very little, she would have wanted to put one in her mouth. The room was so quiet that you could notice the ticking of the clock at once, and yet she found it was not absolutely quiet either. There was a faint, very, very faint humming sound. If hoovers had been invented in those days, Polly would have thought it was the sound of a hoover being worked a long way away, several rooms away and several floors below, but it was a nicer sound than that, a more musical tone, only so faint that you could hardly hear it. "It's all right, there's no one then here," said over her shoulder to Diggory. She was speaking above a whisper now, and Diggory came out blinking and looking as extremely dirty as Polly was too. "This is no good," he said. "It's not an empty house at all. We better bunk before anyone comes." "What do you think those are?" said pointing at the colourful rings by Polly. "Oh, come on," said Diggory. "The sooner—" He never finished what he's saying, for the moment something happened. The high black chair in front of the fire moved suddenly, and there rose up in out of it, like a phantomic demon coming out of a trap door, an alarming form of Uncle Andrew. They were not in the empty house at all. They were in Diggory's house, in the forbidden study. Both children went, oh, realizing their terrible mistake. They felt they ought to have all along, but they hadn't gone nearly far enough. Uncle Andrew was tall and very thin. He had a long, clean-shaven face with a sharply pointed nose, and extremely bright eyes, and a great tousled mop of grey hair. Diggy was quite speechless, for Uncle Andrew looked 1,000 times more alarming than he had ever been before. Polly was not so frightened yet, but she soon was. The very first thing Uncle Andrew did was to walk across to the door of the room, shut it, turn the key in the lock, and then turned around, fixed the children with bright eyes, and smiled, showing all of his teeth. "There," he said. "Now my fool of a sister can't get at you. It was dreadfully unlike anything a grown-up would have been expected to do. Polly's heart came into her mouth, and she and Diggory backed towards the tiny door they had come in. Uncle Andrew was too quick for them. He got behind them, shut the door to, stood in front of it. Then he rubbed his hands, made his knuckles crack. He had long, beautifully white fingers. "I am delighted to see you," he said. "2 children are just what I wanted." "Please, Mr. Ketterley," said Polly, "it is nearly my dinner time and I've got to get home. Will you let us out, please?" "Not just yet," said Uncle Andrew. "This is too good of an opportunity to miss. I wanted 2 children, you see. I'm in the middle of a great experiment. I tried it on a guinea pig, and it seemed to work, but then a guinea pig can't tell you anything, and then can't explain to you how to come back." "Look here, Uncle Andrew," said Diggory. "It's really dinner time, and they'll be looking for us in a moment. You must let us out." "Must," said Uncle Andrew. Diggory and Polly glanced at one another. They dared not say anything, but the glances meant, "Isn't this dreadful? We must humour him. If you let us go for dinner now, we will come back after dinner," said Polly. "But how do I know that you would?" said Uncle Andrew with a cunning smile. Then he seemed to change his mind. "Well, well," he said, "if you must go, I suppose you must. I can't expect 2 youngsters like you to find it fun talking to an old buffer like me," he stated, and went on. "You've got no idea how lonely I am sometimes. But no matter, go to your dinner, but I must give you a present before you go. Not every day I see a little girl in my dingy old study, especially if I must say so, such a very attractive young lady as yourself." Polly began to think he might not really be mad at her after all. "Won't you like a ring, my dear?" said Uncle Andrew to Polly. "You mean one of the yellow or the green ones? How lovely!" "Not a green one," said Uncle Andrew. "I'm afraid I can't give the green ones away, but I would be delighted to give you any of the yellow ones, with my love. Come on and try one of them on." Polly had now quite gotten over her fright, and felt sure that the old gentleman was not mad. There was clearly something strangely attractive about those bright rings. She moved over to the tray. "Why, I declare," she said, "that humming noise gets louder here. It's almost as if the rings were making it." "What a funny fancy, my dear," said Uncle Andrew with a laugh. It sounded more like a natural laugh, but Diggory had seen an eager, almost greedy look on his face. "Polly, don't be a fool," he shouted. "Don't touch them." It was too late. Exactly as he spoke, Polly's hand went out to touch one of the rings. Immediately, without a flash or a noise or a warning of sorts, there was no Polly. Diggory and his uncle were alone in the room.